Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to make a miniature grandfather clock with inexpensive tools and supplies which can be found in any hobby or craft store. Now, the easiest wood to work with on these types of projects is basswood, and I think this is referred to as limewood across the pond. A sheet of 1/16 of an inch thick wood from the local craft store will work very well. However, you can also use these same techniques with exotic woods if you want something truly impressive. I know the majority of people watching this video will want to create at least their first version out of the easiest wood to work with possible, which is why I'm using basswood. Now, I have this video hosted on both my Patreon site as well as YouTube. I'm going to discuss the dimensions of the wood I'm using for every single piece so you can follow along with me. If you'd prefer to print out the plans, they're located at the Patreon site, the link to which is in the video description below. Now, the dimensions that I refer to in this video work with a small 15/16 of an inch clock face, and I purchased mine at a local department store, and it was actually a wristwatch that I simply cut off the band. Now, if you download the plans from the Patreon site, you can enlarge or reduce them as you wish in order to fit whatever clock size you purchase or have on hand. Just know that it's really important that you do enlarge the dimensions of the parts you're using if your clock face is more than 15/16 of an inch in diameter, or you will end up having to purchase a 15/16 of an inch or smaller clock face at the end of the project. Okay, so let's talk about the materials that we're going to need for this project. We're going to need a 1/16 of an inch thick small sheet of basswood, an 1/8 of an inch thick basswood dowel, hobby knife, wood glue, and sandpaper. And the sandpaper that you're going to want to use is 150 grit or finer, preferably finer, and maybe even 2 or 3 sheets of differing grades of sandpaper. I think I've listed here 150 grit. I also have 400, but it's really up to you. You just want to have sandpaper that will leave a nice finish on your project when you're done. You don't want to be using anything that's just going to scratch up this wood because it's just so soft. You'll also need a ruler showing 1/16 of an inch thick markings, safety goggles, small watch as we discussed earlier, and fine chain found in the craft sections of most department stores, a metallic thumbtack, which should, if you can, be the same color as the fine chain, a paper clip, paint to match the color of the metallic thumbtack, and a mechanical or a very sharp pencil, and a clear piece of very thin plastic, like a report cover plastic. And that's probably about the most random sheet of materials I've ever seen, but that's what we'll need for this project. Okay, so before I read off the dimensions of our first structure, I want to stress that when you draw your patterns onto your wood, to make sure that the grain of the wood always runs lengthwise parallel to the long edges. This really is a piece of furniture in miniature, so it holds true for large pieces, also holds true for small pieces. Okay, using a mechanical or a very sharp pencil and a ruler, lightly draw a square on your basswood sheet 1 3/4 of an inch by 1 1/8 of an inch. Draw the box so that the grain of the wood runs with the longest side of each box as discussed earlier. This we'll call part A. Now, if your basswood sheet has nice, straight, smooth, flat edges, definitely use the edges of your sheet as one of the edges for your box. This photo assumes that the edges of your wood are most definitely not straight, however, and that you need to draw your boxes in the middle of the sheet. Note how the boxes here have also been drawn in clusters. This is to help minimize the number of lines you need to draw and also to ensure your lines remain straight. It also makes it easier to end up with perfectly straight angles on your boxes. Now, draw a 1 5/8 of an inch by 1 1/16 of an inch square. We'll call this part B. Parts A and B will eventually be our first subassembly and will form the base of the clock. The second subassembly drawings will eventually comprise a box which will be assembled on top of this base. Draw two squares of the same dimensions, 7/8 of an inch by 1 5/8 of an inch. We'll call these pieces C, and they'll form the sides of our box. Now draw two more squares, both 1 3/8 of an inch by 1 5/8 of an inch. These will form the front and back of our box, and we'll call these parts D. Okay, now it's time to begin cutting. So when you cut out your shapes, don't under any circumstances apply a lot of pressure with your blade as you're cutting. Just let the blade do the work with multiple passes and make sure that you're not using dull blades. And you're going to find that cutting with the grain of the wood is pretty easy, but cutting perpendicularly is definitely a lot harder. Just take your time and be careful. This is also an area where proper eye protection is definitely critical. If you do apply too much pressure while cutting, the tip of your blade can break. And of course, you definitely don't want your eye to get hit by a small sharp piece of metal. So it's important to be careful during this process. Wear your safety goggles. As a final health point, please also wear a dust mask when you're sanding your parts in the next steps. You should now have the pieces pictured in the photo. Measure all of your pieces to make sure the dimensions are exact. It's really easy to cut out additional boxes or even sand boxes that are too long or too wide. Now, however you do it, just make sure that your parts are exact or they won't fit together well, and you'll have unsightly errors in your project. Now, lightly round the top edges of parts A and B by first sanding them against a piece of fine sandpaper on a flat surface, with the relevant edge to be sanded laying against sandpaper at a 45-degree angle, and moving the piece sideways back and forth gently until a sharp corner is gone. That sounds a lot more complicated than it really is. You're just rounding off the corner of one of the edges. Now sand this way really even along the entire piece. You want your edge to still be exact, just evenly sanded. Do this for 3 of the top edges of each piece, not all 4. The top edge of each piece that you do not round over will be the back of each piece. So once you've evenly sanded the corners off of the relevant 3 edges, tear off a small piece of your sandpaper and use your thumb to gently work the sandpaper around the edges, rounding them out. Your thumb will help the sandpaper to wrap around the edge, creating a nice rounded edge. Now grab a piece of your finer sandpaper and do it again. Your goal is to have perfectly uniform rounded edges, except for the back. Do not round the back edges of either piece. Now I should mention that people see and feel things differently. Yeah, that sounded funny. But what I mean is that the technique I described is what works best for me personally to create rounded edges on small pieces of wood. And you might find, and you probably will find, that different methods work better for you. Just experiment around and use some methods that work best for you. There's a lame woodworking joke that if you ask 3 woodworkers the best way to do something, you'll get 3 different opinions. And I found that to be definitely true. So what I'm trying to say is to make this project yours. If you'd like your pieces to be different dimensions, go for it. If you want the pieces to all have square edges, go for it. If you want to skip the molding pieces later, go for it. The goal of all this is just to get people to spend more time relaxing and engaging the creative sides of their minds for a change. This is definitely about the journey and not as much about the destination. However, it is possible to end up with a pretty cool destination, so to speak, with this project in the end. Okay, back to the project. Place part B on top of part A, but don't glue them together yet. The backs of the pieces should be flush, which will let the top of part A underneath show equally in the front and the sides. Sand part B wherever you have to until you have the proper uniformity all around the base with parts A and B flush and back and a 1/16 of an inch gap showing all around the front and sides of A when piece B is sitting directly on top of it. And just make sure that the rounded edges of both pieces are facing up. Now you can apply a really thin layer of glue to the top of part A right in the middle. You need to have enough glue to affix the parts together, but not so much that it leaks out the edges when the pieces are pressed together. Now, do not press part B directly down on the part A. Lower it down at an angle so any excess glue is forced out of the back. We don't want glue leaking out the front or the sides at this point. If you do have leakage, it's usually best to let the glue harden before carefully removing it with an exacto blade later. And it's actually pretty easy to cut small dry glue blobs away from wood. If you try wiping the glue away when it's wet, it'll just be pressed into the fibers of the wood, and later applications of stain won't be able to penetrate very well, and you'll just end up with a blotchy appearance. Okay, now it's time to gently place a flat object on top of the assembly to ensure the pieces don't warp while drying. And this can be a little tricky. You want to make sure that the pieces don't get out of alignment when you apply the object, whatever it is. This photo shows a rubber 10-pound dumbbell resting on one edge on top of the pieces. These little pieces do definitely want to warp when they come in contact with glue, so it's very important to ensure that they're glued firmly, flatly, and perfectly together. Now, draw and cut out one more A piece and two more B pieces. Round both the edges, top and bottom, of the front and sides of piece A. Round only one edge of the front and sides of each piece B. Now, draw and cut out a 1 inch by 1.5 inch piece, which we'll call piece E. As with pieces B, only round one edge on the front and sides of piece E. So these four pieces will form the top of the box and essentially be the base for the next section of clock. It might be best to rewind what I've just mentioned. I know that was a lot of measurements, and just write it down before proceeding so you don't accidentally sand where you weren't supposed to. This piece of four pieces, that is actually going to look pretty cool later. You just have to take your time with it. Now place one of the B pieces on top of piece A, but don't glue it yet. Now do you remember how you rounded the edges of the top of piece B? The unrounded edges should sit against piece A as shown in the photo. This assembly will be similar to the base of the clock, only that part A in this case will be rounded on both sides. Now glue the pieces together just like the base using the same gluing technique as we discussed a little while ago. Their backs should be flush with each other, and piece A should be 1/16 of an inch wider than piece B around the sides and front, just like before. Now you can place a flat object on top of them so they dry perfectly against each other. Now take your remaining B and E piece. Round the top three edges of both pieces, but not the back. Using the same techniques as discussed previously, glue piece E on top of B so the rounded edges of both pieces are facing up, and so B shows uniformly under piece E by 1/16 of an inch. Now, as before, place a flat object on top of this assembly to dry. Now glue the long side edge of one of the D pieces to a long inside edge of one of the C pieces, forming a 90-degree angle as shown in the photo. Now gently secure this new L shape against the inside corner of a desk drawer or similar structure which has a 90-degree angle in order to ensure the L shape has perfect 90-degree angles when dry. Now glue your remaining C and D pieces together in the same way and repeat the drying process so you end up with two perfect L shapes. When both pieces have dried, just dry fit them together and really gently sand the edges where necessary to ensure they form a perfect box with the smallest seams possible. Now, with this box still not glued together, just rest it on top of your initial base comprised of parts A and B. If the dry fit box is flush with the back of the base, is there a perfect 1/16 of an inch section of base visible along the sides? There should be. And you should also have a 1/8 of an inch gap along the front. We'll be placing pillars in front of the seams of the front corners later in case you're curious as to why the gap is so large up there. And you might need to sand the edges of each of your D pieces together in order to have a perfect 1/16 of an inch section of visible base around the front and sides. This is where your own personal taste comes in. Just sand the edges of pieces D as much as you like until the box is as wide or as narrow as you like when you dry fit your pieces together. Just make sure to evenly sand the pieces so when you place the parts together you don't have gaps at the top or bottom of your box when you eventually glue the box together. Okay, so once you're satisfied that your box is the proper shape, you can glue it together, being mindful not to apply too much glue. Place an object on top of your box while it's drying to ensure there's a nice tight join around all the seams. Now after the glue in your box is dried, it's a good idea to finely sand the box all the way around with the grain of the wood so it's a perfect shape and has a nice smooth surface. Sand the top and bottom of the box as well so the box stands perfectly flush on the base when it's glued, and to ensure that the next assembly fits perfectly atop the box. Now after you've sanded your box, take measurements. You want to make sure that the right side of the box is not higher than the left and vice versa, as well as the front and back. You want everything to be exactly the same height all the way around. Since this is a tall model, any small lean to the left or right or front or back, it'll be really apparent when the clock is complete. So you want to make sure to be pretty precise here. Just sand wherever necessary. Now after you're satisfied with the dimensions of the box, you can glue it to the base. Again, being very sparing with the glue so you don't have glue spots showing up on the outside of the box. You can, however, apply as much glue to the joints internally as you wish, and you probably should since it'll give it more stability. And nothing in there, of course, will be visible later. And just remember the back of the box should be flush with the back of the base. And then place a weight on top of the assembly while it's drying to ensure perfect join between all the parts. Now when the assembly is dry, it's a good idea to do another measurement just to check all the way around the box to make sure you don't have any lean one way or the other. And if necessary, just fine-tune the top of the box by turning it upside down and lightly sanding against a fine piece of sandpaper lying flat on a table. Okay, back to the other assemblies. Assuming both A and B and E assemblies are now dry, you'll flip over your assembly comprised of A and B so B is on the bottom. You'll then glue assembly B and E on top of A so you have a stack. Just look at the photo. From the bottom up, you'll have B, A, B, E. And let's just call this completed assembly F. When this stack is perfectly aligned, place an object on top of this assembly to ensure that all the pieces dry perfectly flat together. After this assembly F is dried, you can install it on top of your box so that part B is centered on top of the box and flush with the back. And again, be careful with your glue. Note how the glue in this photo has been placed on the inside edges of the box to help minimize spillage along the outside of the box when assembly F is installed. And as with all components, a weight has been placed on top of the box to ensure a perfect joint. This photo shows the back side of the box. All of the pieces should be flush and back, or at least very, very close. Later in the build, we'll need to sand the entire back of the clock to ensure a perfectly flat side. We don't necessarily need to do this now, however, but you can if you wish. Now it's time to add some ornamentation. Spindles. Cut a 1 5/8 of an inch length off of your dowel, either by using a small saw or by rocking your exacto blade back and forth across the dowel, rolling the dowel under your blade as you cut. Yeah, this method can take a while. Be careful if you do it this way. This is the method being employed in the photo. Test fit your dowel between the moldings of your box. In the front of your box. Your dowel might be a hair too long. If this is the case, sand the end of your dowel evenly until it fits perfectly between the moldings. Now, using your mechanical pencil, mark your dowel wherever you'd like to see variations and curves. The dowel in photo was marked about 1/8 of an inch from the top and bottom, and 1/4 of an inch from the top and bottom. It was also marked 1 inch from the bottom. Now rock your exacto blade along the markings back and forth across the dowel many times, and eventually all the way around the dowel in order to form small, shallow channels. It's important to make sure your blade is perfectly perpendicular to the dowel while doing this, and that you're rocking the blade perfectly back and forth in order to achieve even lines all the way around the dowel. Don't worry if you need to practice this a bit. If you purchase the normal length of 1/8 inch dowel from a hobby store, you have more material for this project than you'll ever need. Now cut into the channels all the way around the dowel at an angle in order to enlarge the channels, but don't cut in too deep. All you're doing here is to create spaces in which to seat thin folded over sandpaper. Now it's just a matter of sanding the dowels to shape. They can be sanded by holding a small bit of folded sandpaper against the dowel at angles and twisting the dowels in your fingers against the sandpaper. Note that it's easier to use small bits of sandpaper folded over until you get the shape you like. This is actually easier than you might think, it just takes practice. And as I'd mentioned previously, you may have techniques that you find that work better for you than what I'm describing here. And if that's the case, definitely do what works best for you. Now this photo shows the dowel nearing its final shape. Note that there isn't anything from stopping you from making simpler designs for these, or more complex designs for these. It's your project and it should really reflect your own personal taste. Now your dowels can be referred to as spindles. So repeat this process again to create your second spindle. Now you can install your completed spindles right up against the seams in the front of your box. They can be touching your box, and the edges of the dowel should be flush with the side edges of the box. We've now reached the final component of the lower section of the clock. Now cut one square 1 3/16 of an inch wide by 1 5/8 of an inch tall. Now draw a straight line down the center of this piece. The line will be 9 1/2 from either side up and down. If your ruler measures 30 of an inch, it'll be 19 30 from either end. Now very gently and with your ruler to assist your cut, cut a very shallow line right down the center of this line. You'll probably recognize this photo from the beginning of the tutorial. Basically what we're doing here is creating the illusion of a double door configuration on the front of the base. This shallow cut will show up really well when stain or paint is applied at the end of the project. Now, in order to ensure that the line is wide enough, you can actually run your exacto blade right down the line sideways in order to widen the groove. Just make sure to run the blade against both sides of your channel equally when you do this. This photo shows how the blade was held when widening the grooves before it had actually been installed against the model. This photo is also a great segue in actually installing your new door assembly. After you're satisfied with the channel down the center of your assembly, dry fit it into the space between your spindles. Just sand it wherever necessary in order to achieve a good fit. If you need to sand the width of the door, make sure you sand each side equally so your center line remains in the center. You can have a very tiny gap along the top and bottom to simulate the doors not extending all the way up and down. They don't need to be flush against the top and bottom. In fact, they probably should not be. Once you're satisfied with the fit of your door, place a dab of glue on the center of the back of the door and press into position. You might need to lay your assembly on its back so the door doesn't move out of position while drying, and I do recommend that that's what you do. And now congratulations are in order because you've just completed the hardest part of this project.